Claire Ashford came home early on a Friday afternoon and found her housekeeper, Rosa Alvarez, slipping an $85,000 Patek Philippe watch into a worn fabric bag. Claire opened her mouth to scream. Then a voice behind her low, urgent cut through the silence. "Stay silent." She turned. Jonah Reed, her personal manager for 3 years, stood there with desperate eyes. The single dad who always left at 4 to pick up his son. Why was he protecting a thief? And what he was about to reveal would shatter everything Claire thought she knew about right and wrong. The Ashford mansion sat in Presidio Heights, like a white Georgian monument to discipline and control. 12 rooms spread across 3 floors, marble flooring that echoed every footstep, a spiral staircase that curved upward like a question mark. Everything had its place. The oil painting of Claire's father hung in the living room beside a glass cabinet displaying his watch collection. The furniture was minimal, expensive, chosen for function rather than warmth. It was the kind of house that impressed visitors but never invited them to stay. Claire Ashford had built her real estate empire from nothing, starting at 21 when her father died, and left her with debt instead of inheritance. She learned early that sentiment was expensive and discipline was currency. At 38, she ran a portfolio worth $40 million and lived alone in a house designed for a family she never had. Her schedule was precise: meetings at 8, lunch at noon, home by 7. Weekends were for reviewing contracts and attending charity galas where she wrote checks but rarely spoke to anyone for longer than 5 minutes. The house reflected her perfectly. Clean lines, no clutter, no mess, no room for error or emotion. She preferred it that way. Chaos was for people who didn't know how to build walls. Rosa Alvarez had worked in that house for 5 years, arriving early and leaving late, moving through rooms like a ghost who understood the importance of being invisible. She lived in a studio apartment in the Mission District with her daughter, Sophia. Claire knew Rosa had a child only because she'd seen the girl once, sitting quietly in the kitchen while Rosa finished her shift. The girl had dark eyes and wore a medical bracelet on her wrist. Claire hadn't asked about it. Boundaries were important. Employees had lives, but those lives belonged outside the mansion's walls. Jonah Reed had been Claire's personal manager for 3 years. He handled her schedule, vetted contractors, managed correspondence, and kept her life running with a precision that matched her own. He was 34. A single father who raised his son alone after his wife died 4 years earlier. Claire respected that he never let personal tragedy interfere with his work. He was efficient, quiet, never asked for special treatment. The only accommodation he requested was leaving at 4 every afternoon to pick up his son from school. Claire approved it without hesitation. Competence deserved respect, and Jonah was the most competent person she'd ever hired. She remembered standing outside his office door about a year ago, hearing him on the phone with his son. His voice had cracked slightly when he said, "Daddy will be home on time, I promise. I'll never leave you waiting." There was something raw in his tone, something that made Claire feel like she was overhearing a prayer instead of a conversation. She'd almost knocked, almost asked if he was all right. But she didn't. The boundary between employer and employee was a line she never crossed. It kept things simple. It kept her safe. On that Friday afternoon in late autumn, Claire left her downtown office early. A meeting with an investor had been canceled at the last minute, freeing up 3 hours she hadn't expected to have. She drove home through the San Francisco streets, the fog rolling in from the bay, the city turning gray and soft at the edges. She pulled into her driveway at 3:15, earlier than she'd been home in months. The house was quiet when she entered. She punched in the security code, slipped off her heels, and set her briefcase on the marble console table. The antique clock in the living room ticked steadily, the only sound in the enormous space. She assumed Rosa had already finished for the day. The woman usually left by 3 on Fridays to pick up her daughter from school. Claire walked toward the staircase, intending to change out of her suit and spend the unexpected free time reviewing a contract. But then she heard it, a faint, uneven breathing coming from the living room. She stopped. Her pulse quickened. She turned and moved quietly toward the doorway, her stockinged feet silent on the marble. Rosa stood in front of the glass cabinet. The door was open. In her trembling hands was the Patek Philippe Calatrava, the watch Claire's father had given her 2 weeks before he died. It was white gold, simple, elegant, worth $85,000. But the money didn't matter. It was the last thing her father had touched, the last gift he'd chosen for her. She could still hear his voice when he handed it to her. "Keep this safe, Claire. Time is the one thing we can't buy back." Rosa stared at the watch like she was holding a loaded gun. Her hands shook. Tears streamed down her face. She looked at it for a long moment, then slowly, carefully, placed it into a worn fabric bag sitting on the floor beside her. Claire felt her breath stop. The world narrowed to a single, impossible image. Rosa. The watch. The bag. Betrayal. She opened her mouth. The word came out like a knife. Rosa. But before the sound fully left her throat, a hand touched her shoulder. A voice spoke from directly behind her, low and urgent and filled with something that sounded like desperation. "Stay silent." Claire spun around. Jonah Reed stood less than 2 feet away. His face was pale. His eyes were wide, pleading. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, trying to decide whether to jump or pull someone else back from the ledge. Claire stared at him. Her brain couldn't process what was happening. Jonah, her manager, the man she trusted with her schedule, her finances, her private information. He was here. He knew. He was telling her to stay silent. Her voice came out cold and sharp. "You knew about this?" Jonah didn't answer. He just looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw something she'd never seen before. Fear. Not for himself, for someone else. Rosa turned around. When she saw Claire and Jonah standing in the doorway, the color drained from her face. The fabric bag slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. The watch rolled out onto the marble, spinning once before coming to rest between them. Rosa's voice was barely a whisper. "Miss Claire, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Claire didn't look at Rosa. She kept her eyes locked on Jonah. Her voice was ice. "You have 60 seconds to explain. If you don't, I'm calling the police." Jonah swallowed hard. He glanced at Rosa, then back at Claire. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something broken underneath it. "I'm not defending theft, Claire. I'm asking you to hear the reason before you make a judgment." Claire's hands clenched into fists. "A reason? What possible reason justifies stealing from someone who trusted you, who paid you, who gave you a home to work in?" Jonah met her gaze. His jaw tightened. "Rosa's daughter is dying, Claire." The words hit like a punch to the chest. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. Claire felt her lungs tighten. She looked at Rosa, who was now on her knees, sobbing quietly, her hands covering her face. Claire forced herself to speak. "That doesn't change what she did." Jonah shook his head slowly. "I know, but it changes why." Claire looked down at the watch on the floor. It gleamed under the soft afternoon light streaming through the window. Her father's watch, the last piece of him she had left, and Rosa had been seconds away from walking out the door with it. She felt something crack inside her chest. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Something that felt like the walls she'd spent years building were starting to show cracks she couldn't control. Jonah took a breath and spoke again, quieter this time. "Just give me 5 minutes, please. If you still want to call the police after that, I won't stop you." Claire looked at him, then at Rosa, still kneeling on the floor, shaking, then at the watch. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew, in that moment, that whatever choice she made would change everything. She bent down and picked up the watch. The metal was cold in her palm. She held it tightly, feeling the weight of it, the memory of her father's hands placing it in hers. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. 5 minutes, then I decide." Claire stood in the center of her living room, holding the watch so tightly her knuckles turned white. Rosa remained on the floor, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Jonah stood between them, not moving, waiting for Claire to give him permission to speak. The grandfather clock ticked in the corner, each second loud enough to feel like a hammer against the silence. Claire's mind was racing, but her voice came out controlled, almost mechanical. This doesn't make sense. If Rosa needed money, she could have asked me. I pay her well, above market rate. Why would she risk everything by stealing? Jonah looked at Rosa, then back at Claire. His voice was careful, measured, because she knew you'd say no. The words landed like a slap. Claire's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? Jonah didn't back down. He met her gaze straight on. Rosa knew that if she came to you asking for help, you'd tell her it wasn't your responsibility. You'd tell her to figure it out herself. And you'd be right. Legally, morally, you don't owe her anything beyond her salary. But that doesn't change the fact that her daughter is dying and she has no other options. Claire felt heat rising in her chest, a mixture of anger and something else she couldn't name. So she decided to steal from me instead? That's the solution? Rosa lifted her head. Her face was wet with tears, her voice hoarse. I didn't want to, Miss Claire. I swear I didn't. I've been trying everything. I went to the bank. They said I don't have enough credit. I asked friends, family. No one has that kind of money. I even went to a loan shark in the mission. He laughed at me. Claire's voice was sharp. What kind of money are we talking about? Rosa's hands trembled as she spoke. $120,000. That's what the hospital said. Sophia needs heart surgery. She has a congenital defect. It's been getting worse. The doctors said if she doesn't have the operation in the next 2 weeks, she won't survive. Claire felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. $120,000. It was a number that meant everything to Rosa and almost nothing to Claire. She could write that check without even looking at her account balance. But that wasn't the point. The point was trust. The point was boundaries. The point was keeping the world organized and predictable and under control. She looked down at the watch in her hand. $85,000. Still not enough for the surgery. Rosa would have needed to steal more, or maybe she planned to. Maybe this was just the beginning. Claire's voice was colder now. And you thought taking my father's watch was the answer? Rosa shook her head, her voice breaking. I wasn't thinking. I was desperate. I thought maybe if I could sell it, I could at least get Sophia into the hospital. At least buy some time. I know it was wrong. I know I deserve whatever happens to me. But please, Miss Claire, just give me 2 weeks. 2 weeks for Sophia to have the surgery. After that, you can call the police. I'll turn myself in. I won't run, I promise. Claire looked at Jonah. He was watching her carefully, and she realized he wasn't surprised by any of this. He'd known. Maybe not about the watch specifically, but he'd known Rosa was in trouble. And he hadn't told her. Her voice came out low and dangerous. When did you find out about this? Jonah didn't flinch. 3 days ago. Rosa told me after work. She was crying in the parking lot. I asked what was wrong, and she told me about Sophia. Claire's jaw tightened. And you didn't think I should know? Jonah's expression softened, but his voice stayed firm. I thought about telling you, but Rosa begged me not to. She said she didn't want charity. She didn't want pity. She just wanted to handle it on her own. Claire laughed bitterly. By stealing from me. Jonah shook his head. I didn't know she was going to do that. I swear, Claire, if I'd known, I would have stopped her. Claire studied his face, searching for a lie. She didn't find one. Jonah looked exhausted, like he'd been carrying a weight he couldn't put down. She thought about the phone call she'd overheard a year ago, the way his voice had cracked when he promised his son he'd never leave him waiting. She thought about the quiet way he worked, never complaining, never asking for anything, and then she thought about what he'd just said. That Rosa knew Claire would say no if she asked for help. The truth of it stung more than she wanted to admit. Claire turned away from both of them and walked to the window. Outside, the fog was rolling in thicker now, turning the city into something soft and unreal. She pressed her hand against the glass, feeling the cold seep into her palm. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. You think I'm heartless? Jonah's response came gently. I think you're careful. There's a difference. Claire closed her eyes. She thought about her father, about the day he handed her the watch. He'd been sick for months, but he'd hidden it well. She didn't know until the end. He'd called her into his study, sat her down, and placed the watch in her hand. Claire, he'd said, his voice weak but steady. You're going to do great things. I know that. But promise me something. Promise me you won't let success make you hard. Don't confuse strength with coldness. They're not the same thing, she'd promised. But standing here now, she wasn't sure she'd kept that promise. She'd built her empire on discipline and distance. She'd learned to protect herself by never letting anyone get too close. And maybe, somewhere along the way, she'd stopped seeing people as people and started seeing them as variables in an equation she needed to control. She turned back to face Rosa and Jonah. Her voice was steady but not unkind. Why didn't you come to me, Rosa? Why didn't you just ask? Rosa looked up at her, eyes red and swollen. Because you're not that kind of person, Miss Claire. You're good to me. You pay me well. You let me bring Sophia to work when I needed to, but you have rules. You keep everything separate. Work is work. Personal is personal. I didn't think you'd want to get involved in my life like that. Claire felt something twist in her chest. Rosa was right. She'd created that distance on purpose. She'd made it clear, without ever saying it out loud, that her employees' problems were not her problems. It kept things clean. It kept her safe from the messiness of other people's lives. But now, standing in her living room with a woman on her knees and her manager looking at her like he was waiting to see who she really was, Claire realized that distance had cost something, maybe more than she'd understood. She looked at Jonah. You said you understand what Rosa is going through. What did you mean by that? Jonah's jaw tightened. He looked like he didn't want to answer, but he did anyway. 4 years ago, my wife was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. The treatment our insurance covered wasn't working. There was an experimental therapy available, but it wasn't approved yet. It cost $200,000. We didn't have it. I thought about taking money from the investment fund I was managing at my old job. I thought about it every single day. I told myself I'd pay it back. That it was just borrowing. That it was worth it if it saved her life. Claire's voice was barely a whisper. Did you do it? Jonah shook his head. No, I couldn't. I knew it was wrong. I knew it would destroy everything I'd built. So I didn't take the money. And 3 months later, my wife died. The silence that followed was suffocating. Claire looked at Jonah and saw something she'd never noticed before. The way he held himself so carefully, like he was always one wrong move away from falling apart. The way he left at 4 every day, not because he had to, but because he'd made a promise to his son that he'd never break. The way he looked at Rosa now, with a kind of understanding that came from standing in the same impossible place she was standing. Claire's voice was quiet. You think you made the wrong choice? Jonah met her eyes. I don't know. I still don't know. But I know that every night, I lie awake wondering if I could have saved her. If I'd just been willing to cross that line, maybe she'd still be here. Maybe Ethan would still have his mother. He looked at Rosa, then back at Claire. I'm not saying Rosa was right to take the watch. I'm not saying you should forgive her or let this go. I'm just saying I understand why she did it. Because when you're standing at the edge and the person you love is about to fall, logic doesn't matter anymore. Right and wrong don't matter. The only thing that matters is whether you tried everything you could. Claire felt her grip on the watch loosen slightly. She looked at Rosa, who was watching her with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. Claire's voice came out harder than she intended. If I let you walk out of here with that watch, what happens next? Do I just pretend this never happened? Do I keep you on staff, knowing you stole from me? Do I set a precedent that anyone in my house can take what they want if they have a sad enough story? Jonah didn't answer right away. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully. I think you have to decide what kind of person you want to be. Not what kind of boss. Not what kind of businesswoman. What kind of person. Claire's anger flared. Don't turn this into a moral test, Jonah. This isn't about me. This is about Rosa breaking my trust. Jonah's voice stayed calm. It's about both. Rosa made a choice. Now you have to make one too. Claire wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come, because he was right. This wasn't just about Rosa. It was about what Claire valued more. The rules she'd built her life on, or the person standing in front of her, broken and terrified and willing to sacrifice everything for her child. She looked at Rosa again. How old is Sophia? Rosa's voice trembled. 9. She just turned 9 last month. Claire thought about her own childhood. She'd been 21 when her father died, old enough to understand loss, but young enough to feel like the world had been pulled out from under her. Sophia was 9. She wouldn't understand why her mother couldn't save her. She'd just know that her heart was failing and no one was helping. Claire set the watch down on the coffee table. She didn't put it back in the cabinet. She just left it there, in the open, like she was testing herself to see if she could let go of control for even a moment. Her voice was cold, but there was a crack in it now. Tell me about Sophia. Rosa looked up, surprised. What? Claire repeated herself, slower this time. Tell me about your daughter. What's she like? Rosa's face softened despite the tears. She's smart, so smart. She wants to be a doctor when she grows up. She says she wants to help kids like her. She reads all the time, medical books, even. She doesn't understand all of it, but she tries. Claire felt something tighten in her throat. Does she know how sick she is? Rosa nodded, tears streaming down her face again. She knows. She tells me not to cry. She says it's going to be okay, but I can see it in her eyes. She's scared. She's 9 years old and she's scared she's going to die. Claire turned away. She couldn't look at Rosa anymore. The weight of it was too much. She walked to the window again, staring out at the fog, trying to find some kind of clarity in the blurred edges of the city. Behind her, Jonah spoke quietly. I'm not asking you to forgive Rosa. I'm not even asking you to help her. I'm just asking you to see her. Really see her. Not as a housekeeper who broke the rules, but as a mother who's out of options. Claire closed her eyes. She thought about her father again, about the promise she'd made. Don't let success make you hard. Don't confuse strength with coldness. She'd spent so many years building walls, creating distance, protecting herself from the chaos of other people's emotions. And it had worked. She'd built an empire. She'd survived loss and betrayal and failure. But standing here now, she realized something she'd been avoiding for a long time. She was tired. Tired of being alone. Tired of pretending that control was the same thing as peace. Tired of living in a house that felt more like a museum than a home. She turned around. Rosa was still on the floor, looking at her with desperate, pleading eyes. Jonah stood beside her, his expression unreadable but his posture protective. Claire's voice was quiet but firm. Stand up, Rosa. Rosa hesitated, then slowly got to her feet. She looked like she was bracing for the worst. Claire walked over to her, stopping just a few feet away. I'm not going to call the police. Rosa's breath caught. Miss Claire. Claire held up a hand. I'm not finished. I'm not calling the police because I understand why you did what you did. But that doesn't mean I forgive it. And it doesn't mean things will go back to the way they were. Rosa nodded quickly, tears streaming down her face. I understand. I'll leave. I'll pack my things. I just need... Claire interrupted her. I'm going to pay for Sophia's surgery. The room went completely still. Rosa stared at her, mouth open, unable to process the words. Jonah's eyes widened. Claire continued, her voice steady. I'll arrange for the payment to go through an anonymous charitable fund. The hospital won't know it came from me. Sophia will get the surgery she needs, but there are conditions. Rosa was shaking now, nodding frantically. Anything you want. Claire's expression was firm. You don't work for me as a housekeeper anymore. I'm transferring you to a new position in my company's charitable division. You'll help connect families in medical crises with resources. Your salary will be $60,000 a year. You'll start next month, after Sophia recovers. Rosa collapsed to her knees again, this time not out of fear but out of overwhelming relief. She sobbed into her hands, her whole body shaking. Claire looked at Jonah. He was staring at her like he'd never seen her before. She kept her voice even. "The $20,000 you were planning to give Rosa. Keep it. Use it for Ethan's college fund. He's going to need it more than Sophia does now." Jonah shook his head slowly, his voice thick. "Claire, I don't know what to say." Claire's expression didn't change. "Don't say anything. This isn't charity. It's a choice. My choice. And I'm making it because I'm tired of living in a world where the only thing that matters is being right." She looked down at Rosa, who was still crying on the floor. "Sophia is going to live, Rosa. But you and I are going to have a very different relationship from now on. You're going to work for me in a way that matters. You're going to help people who are standing where you're standing right now. Do you understand?" Rosa looked up, her face wet and broken and grateful beyond words. Yes, Miss Claire, thank you. Thank you so much." Claire didn't smile. She just nodded. Then she picked up the watch from the coffee table and walked out of the room, leaving Rosa and Jonah standing in the soft afternoon light. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't happiness. It was something quieter, something like the first breath after holding it too long. She sat down on the edge of her bed and looked at the watch in her hand. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Promise me you won't let success make you hard." For the first time in years, Claire felt like she'd kept that promise. 3 weeks passed before Claire heard anything about Sophia's surgery. She'd arranged the payment through her company's charitable trust, routing it through 2 separate foundations to ensure complete anonymity. The hospital received the funds within 48 hours. Sophia was scheduled for surgery 6 days later. Claire didn't ask for updates. She told herself it was because she didn't want to get involved, but the truth was more complicated. She was afraid that if the surgery failed, she'd feel responsible. Afraid that if it succeeded, she'd have to acknowledge that her choice had meant something beyond a transaction. Rosa hadn't come back to the mansion. Claire had arranged for her to take a leave of absence while Sophia recovered, with full pay. Jonah handled the coordination, sending Claire brief email updates that she read quickly and never responded to. The house felt emptier without Rosa moving through it, straightening things that didn't need straightening, making sure everything was in its place. Claire hired a temporary service to handle the cleaning, but they worked with an efficiency that felt mechanical. They didn't care about the house the way Rosa had. They just did the job and left. On a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks and 2 days after the incident, Claire sat in her home office, reviewing a contract for a commercial property acquisition. The numbers blurred together on the screen. She couldn't focus. She kept thinking about the watch, still sitting in the glass cabinet where she'd returned it. She'd looked at it every day since, and each time, she remembered Rosa's hands trembling as she held it, remembered the desperation in her eyes. Her phone buzzed. A text from Jonah. She opened it, expecting another update about the charitable division staffing or a scheduling conflict. Instead, the message was short. "Sophia made it through. Doctors say full recovery expected." Claire stared at the words. She read them 3 times. Then she set the phone down and covered her face with her hands. She didn't cry. She just sat there, breathing, feeling something unfamiliar moving through her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it. Relief. Not the kind that came from closing a deal or avoiding a loss. The kind that came from knowing a 9-year-old girl was going to grow up. That she'd get to read her medical books and maybe become a doctor someday. That her mother wouldn't have to bury her. Claire picked up her phone and typed a response. "Good." She almost sent it. Then she deleted it and wrote something else. "Thank you for letting me know." She sent it before she could reconsider. A minute later, another message came through from Jonah. "Rosa wants to thank you. She knows it was you." Claire's stomach tightened. She'd been careful. The payments were anonymous. But of course Rosa knew. Who else would have done it? She typed back. "Tell her I'm glad Sophia is okay. And tell her I expect her to start her new position on the 1st of next month. No exceptions." Jonah's response was immediate. "Understood." Claire set the phone down and went back to the contract. But the numbers still didn't make sense. She gave up after 10 minutes and walked downstairs to the kitchen. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the window, looking out at the garden. The fog had cleared for once, and the late afternoon sun lit up the roses her landscaper had planted last spring. She'd never really looked at them before. They were just part of the background, something the service maintained. But now she noticed how the light caught the petals, how some were deep red and others were almost pink, how they moved slightly in the breeze. She thought about what Jonah had said. What kind of person do you want to be? Not what kind of boss, not what kind of businesswoman. What kind of person? She'd spent so long defining herself by her accomplishments, by the empire she'd built, by the control she maintained over every aspect of her life. But standing here in her empty kitchen, looking at roses she'd never really seen, she wondered if she'd been measuring the wrong things. 2 days later, Claire did something she hadn't done in years. She invited people to her house, not for a business meeting or a charity event, just to be there. She sent a message to Jonah asking if he and Ethan wanted to come for dinner on Friday. She invited Rosa and Sophia too, once they were ready. She didn't overthink it. She just sent the messages and waited. Jonah responded first. Ethan and I would love to come. Thank you. Rosa's message came an hour later. Miss Claire, Sophia and I are honored. We will be there. Friday evening arrived with the kind of soft light that made San Francisco feel like a painting. Claire spent the afternoon preparing, something she hadn't done in longer than she could remember. She'd hired a catering service for the food, but she set the table herself, choosing plates and glasses with more care than usual. She put fresh flowers in the center of the dining room table. White roses, simple, clean, but warm. When the doorbell rang at 6:30, Claire felt her heart rate pick up. She opened the door to find Jonah standing there with Ethan, a 7-year-old boy with dark hair and his father's quiet eyes. The boy was holding a small box wrapped in newspaper comics. Jonah smiled. Ethan wanted to bring you something. The boy stepped forward and held out the box. His voice was shy but earnest. Dad said you like books. I made you a bookmark. Claire took the box and opened it carefully. Inside was a laminated bookmark with a hand-drawn picture of a house. It was simple, the kind of drawing a child makes with crayons and care. At the top, in uneven letters, it said, "Home is where people care." Claire looked at Ethan and felt something in her throat tighten. This is beautiful. Thank you. Ethan grinned. Dad helped with the laminating part, but I did the drawing. Claire smiled. It felt strange on her face, like a muscle she hadn't used in a long time. You did a wonderful job. Rosa and Sophia arrived 10 minutes later. Sophia was thin and pale, but her eyes were bright. She wore a medical bracelet on her wrist and a pink sweater that looked new. Rosa stood beside her daughter with a protective hand on her shoulder, her expression a mixture of gratitude and nervousness. Claire greeted them at the door. I'm glad you could come. Sophia looked up at her with wide eyes. Thank you for saving my life, Miss Claire. The words hit Claire harder than she expected. She crouched down slightly so she was at eye level with the girl. You're going to do great things, Sophia. I know it. Sophia smiled. I want to be a doctor, so I can help other kids like me. Claire nodded. Then you will be, and when you're ready, you come talk to me. I'll help however I can. They moved into the dining room, and for the first time in years, Claire's house felt like more than a museum. The table was full. Ethan talked excitedly about his school project on dinosaurs. Sophia listened with quiet interest, asking questions that made Ethan light up even more. Rosa sat beside her daughter, watching her with the kind of love that didn't need words. Jonah was quieter, but Claire caught him looking around the room with something like wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe they were all there. Halfway through dinner, Ethan asked Claire a question that made everyone go quiet. Miss Claire, are you lonely? Jonah's face went red. Ethan, that's not... Claire held up a hand, stopping him. She looked at the boy, who was watching her with genuine curiosity, not judgment. She thought about lying, about giving some polite answer that would smooth over the awkwardness. But she didn't. Her voice was soft. I was, for a long time. But I'm working on that. Ethan nodded seriously, like she'd just shared something important. That's good. My dad says it's okay to be sad sometimes, but it's better when you have people. Claire glanced at Jonah, who was looking at his son with a mixture of pride and embarrassment. She smiled. Your dad is right. After dinner, they moved to the living room. Sophia sat on the couch, tired but happy, while Ethan showed her a book about space that Claire had pulled from her father's old collection. Rosa and Jonah stood near the window, talking quietly. Claire watched them all from the doorway, holding a glass of wine she hadn't touched. Jonah walked over to her. His voice was low enough that only she could hear. You didn't have to do this. Claire looked at him. I know. Jonah studied her face for a moment. Can I ask you something? Claire nodded. He spoke carefully. That day, when I said stay silent, did you think I was betraying you? Claire considered the question. She could have lied, could have said no, that she understood immediately, but she didn't. Her voice was honest. Yes. For a minute, I did. I thought you were protecting someone who'd stolen from me. I thought you were choosing her over me. Jonah's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. And now? Claire looked across the room at Rosa, who was watching Sophia with the kind of love that could move mountains. She looked at Ethan, who was explaining something about Mars to Sophia with complete seriousness. She looked back at Jonah. Now I think you were protecting someone who needed it. And you were trying to show me that there's more than one way to be right. Jonah's voice was quiet. You didn't have to listen. Claire shook her head. Yes, I did. Because you were right. I'd built so many walls that I couldn't see past them anymore. I thought control was the same thing as strength, but it's not. Sometimes strength is letting go. Sometimes it's choosing compassion over rules. Jonah looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that surprised her. You're not the person I thought you were. Claire raised an eyebrow. Is that a compliment? Jonah smiled. Yes. I thought you were someone who couldn't change, but you did. That takes more courage than most people have. Claire didn't respond. She just looked out at her living room, at the people filling a space that had been empty for so long, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not the kind that came from control or accomplishment. The kind that came from connection. From choosing to see people instead of keeping them at a distance. Later that night, after everyone had left, Claire stood alone in her living room. The house was quiet again, but it felt different now. Less like a museum, and more like a place where things had happened, where people had laughed and talked and existed together. She walked over to the glass cabinet and looked at her father's watch. She picked it up and held it, feeling its familiar weight. Then she whispered something she'd been holding inside for weeks. I kept my promise, Dad. I didn't let it make me hard. She set the watch back in its place and turned off the lights. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, she thought about Jonah's words from that first day. Stay silent. He'd been asking her to pause, to listen, to see beyond the surface of things. And in doing that, he'd given her something she didn't know she needed. A chance to be someone better than who she'd been. Claire lay in bed that night and realized something that made her smile in the darkness. Her house wasn't empty anymore. Not because it was full of people, but because she'd finally let people in. And that made all the difference.